Nah, my brother didn't ask the doctors if I was going to make it. He asked them how much it would cost if I did. He said it standing in the hallway outside the ICU, loud enough that a nurse named Patricia heard him and wrote it down. I know this because she told me later, after everything, when she handed me a folded piece of paper with her handwriting on it and said, "I thought you might need this someday." She was right. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in a 3-bedroom house in Lansing, Michigan, with my parents and my older brother, Daniel. My father passed when I was 14, a heart attack, quick, no warning. After that, it was just the 3 of us, my mother, my brother, and me. My mother was not a cruel woman. I want to be clear about that. She loved us in the way that some people love things they're not entirely sure how to hold, carefully, at a slight distance, worried about dropping them. She worked 2 jobs most of my childhood. She was tired in a way that went bone deep. I understood that, even then. Daniel was 6 years older than me. By the time my father died, Daniel was already 20, already out of the house most of the time, already building whatever version of himself he wanted to be. When my father's absence left a gap in our home, Daniel stepped partway into it. Not because he was naturally nurturing, but because it gave him something. Authority. A role. A reason to have opinions about how things should be done. He had opinions about how things should be done. He had opinions about me specifically. I was born with a moderate hearing loss in my left ear. It required a hearing aid from age 4, a specialist every year, and, when I was 9, a surgery to address some structural issues that were making things worse. My mother paid for all of it. My father's life insurance helped for a while, but medical costs have a way of outlasting whatever money you thought you had. Daniel never forgot what I cost. He didn't say it directly when I was small, but he had a way of referencing it. Comments about how much the specialist charged. Observations about insurance premiums. Once, when I was maybe 12 and asked if I could go on a school trip to Washington, D.C., he said, without looking up from his phone, "Probably not the best year for extra expenses, Claire." He wasn't paying for anything at that point. He was 24 and living with a roommate across town. But he said it like he was the one keeping the lights on. I learned early to ask for less. I took a part-time job at 16, paid for my own things when I could, tried to be small in the ways that Daniel seemed to need me to be small. It didn't earn me any warmth from him. Some people don't soften when you stop being an inconvenience. They just find a new reason. The person who saw me clearly, who always had, was my mother's older sister, my Aunt Ruth. Aunt Ruth lived 40 minutes away in a house that smelled like coffee and old books. She called me every Sunday. She came to my high school graduation with a card that had $50 in it and a handwritten note that said, "I am so proud of the person you are becoming, and I cannot wait to see what's next." I kept that note. I still have it, in a shoebox under my bed, next to a photograph of the 2 of us at her kitchen table, both of us laughing at something I can't remember now. Aunt Ruth never had children of her own. She had a long career as a paralegal, a modest house she owned outright, and a clarity about people that I think came from spending decades watching what happened when families didn't put things in writing. She put everything in writing. I didn't know that at the time. I just knew she loved me in the uncomplicated way that I had always been a little hungry for. I graduated from Michigan State with a degree in accounting. I got a job at a mid-size firm in Grand Rapids. I found an apartment I could afford. I built a life that was mine, small and manageable and genuinely good. I had a best friend named Joanna who I'd known since freshman year and who texted me every morning with something between a life update and a comedy routine. I had a routine. I had peace. I talked to my mother every week or 2. I saw Daniel at holidays. He had married a woman named Trish, had 2 kids, lived in the same county as my mother. He had positioned himself over the years as the responsible one, the one who showed up, the one who managed things. My mother relied on him for practical matters. I think she found it easier than asking me, given the distance. I told myself that was fine. It was mostly fine. The morning of March 4th was a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because I had an early team meeting and I was running behind and I was thinking about that. Only that, when I pulled out of my apartment complex and onto the main road, the other driver ran a red light. He was in a pickup truck, a company vehicle, going too fast for the intersection. He hit the driver's side of my car. I don't remember the impact. I don't remember anything between the green light in front of me and waking up 6 days later with the machine breathing for me and a tube down my throat, and Joanna sitting in a chair beside my bed with red eyes and a paper coffee cup she was holding like it was the only solid thing left in the world. What I learned afterward, pieced together from Joanna and Patricia the nurse, and eventually from the police report, the other driver had insurance. A commercial policy through his employer, a construction company out of Kalamazoo. My own car insurance also had substantial medical coverage. Between the two, my hospital bills were, in the eyes of every person with any legal or financial knowledge, entirely covered. The construction company's insurer had already been notified. My own insurer had already opened a claim. There was no scenario, not one, in which I was personally responsible for paying those bills. My brother was informed of this when he arrived at the hospital on March 4th. He was listed as my secondary emergency contact, behind Joanna, because I had filled out that form 4 years ago and hadn't updated it after our relationship became more distant. The hospital called Joanna first. Joanna arrived within the hour. Daniel arrived 3 hours later, having, as he explained to the nurses, needed to handle some things first. The attending physician explained my condition to both of them. She explained the insurance situation. She used clear language. She told them that the commercial insurer had already confirmed coverage and that my personal policy provided additional protection. She said the financial picture was, as she put it, not a concern. Daniel asked her to put a number on the worst-case scenario anyway. She told him the number. He said, "And if she doesn't make it?" The physician told me this herself, weeks later, when I came back for a follow-up. She said she had thought, at first, that he was asking out of grief, out of the panicked bargaining that sometimes happens in waiting rooms. She said she revised that interpretation when he followed up by asking about the process for making end-of-life decisions for an incapacitated patient. He was not my healthcare proxy. I had designated Joanna as my healthcare proxy 18 months earlier, through a legal form provided by my employer's HR department during an open enrollment period. My employer had a whole packet about advance directives. I had filled it out at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon and felt very adult about it. Joanna knew she was my proxy. She had the paperwork. She had mentioned it to the hospital when she arrived. What Joanna did not know was that Daniel had told the intake coordinator during the first chaotic hour that he was my next of kin and that he had authority to make medical decisions. He said this with confidence. He had my mother's number in his phone, and he mentioned it in a way that suggested backup. In the confusion of that first hour, a Tuesday morning, the unit understaffed, 3 other critical patients on the floor. No one immediately cross-referenced his claim against Joanna's documentation. He signed a form. I don't know exactly what form. My attorney later described it as an improvised end-of-life directive, not a standard DNR, not something with clear legal standing, but something that sat in my file and created ambiguity. The physician who told me about his question in the hallway also told me that she had been presented with this form and had declined to act on it, citing the existence of my actual healthcare proxy documentation and her own professional judgment that I was not in the terminal condition. She had a colleague who had acted differently in a similar situation, she said. She said it carefully, without elaborating. Patricia wrote down what Daniel said in the hallway because she had been a nurse for 19 years, and she knew the difference between fear and calculation. Joanna, meanwhile, had been making phone calls. She had reached my mother. My mother had called Daniel. My mother later told me that Daniel told her the hospital costs could be significant, and that he was looking out for the family. She did not know at that point what looking out for the family meant in practice. She found out the same way I did. While I was unconscious, Daniel contacted Aunt Ruth. He told her I was in critical condition. He told her the prognosis was uncertain. He told her that my medical bills could be financially devastating and that the family needed to make some practical decisions. He did not tell her about the insurance coverage. He told her he was worried about my long-term care needs and that it might make sense to discuss the house. Aunt Ruth owned her house outright. It was assessed at $420,000. She had lived there for 27 years. Daniel suggested that a temporary transfer of certain assets might protect them in the event that I required long-term care and exhausted various family resources. He used words like Medicaid planning and asset protection. He had clearly researched this enough to sound plausible to someone who was frightened and grieving and focused on the niece she loved who was lying in a hospital bed. Aunt Ruth told him she would think about it. She called her own attorney that same afternoon. His name was Gerald. He was 70 years old. He had handled her affairs for 2 decades. And when she told him what Daniel had said, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Ruth, I need you to do nothing. Absolutely nothing. And I need you to not tell Daniel that you called me." She did exactly that. What Daniel did not know was that Aunt Ruth had updated her will 8 months earlier. She had also, at Gerald's recommendation, established a revocable living trust that held the house and her other primary assets. The trust had a specific provision. It named me as the primary beneficiary. It also included a no-contest clause with language that Gerald had drafted carefully and specifically because Aunt Ruth had told him, plainly, that she was worried about her nephew. She had not told me any of this. She said later, when I asked her why, that she hadn't wanted me to feel like she was preparing to die. She said she just wanted to make sure things would be right when the time came. I woke up on March 10th. The tube came out on March 11th. I couldn't speak well for another day after that, and when I could, the first full sentence I managed was asking Joanna if she had fed my cat. She had. She had also, in the 6 days I was unconscious, done the following: confirmed with both insurance companies that my bills were covered, obtained a copy of my healthcare proxy documentation and had it placed prominently in my hospital file, contacted a personal injury attorney named Marcus, who had already begun the process of building a claim against the construction company, and written down, in a notes app on her phone, a time-stamped account of everything she had witnessed from the moment she arrived at the hospital. She showed me the notes on my 3rd day of consciousness. She sat on the edge of my hospital bed and scrolled through them and read them to me in a flat, careful voice, and by the end of it, I was not crying. I was very still. My mother came to see me on day 4. She brought flowers and a casserole she had made and frozen and defrosted and put in a bag. And she sat in the chair beside my bed and held my hand and cried in the way that she sometimes did, softly and without explanation, as if grief were something that just happened to her rather than something she moved through. I let her cry. I didn't say anything about Daniel yet. Daniel came on day 5 with Trish, and he brought a card signed by his kids, and he stood at the foot of my bed and said he was glad I was doing better and that it had been a very stressful week. He said the word stressful, the way people say it when they mean that they were the ones under stress. I looked at him and I said, "Thank you for coming." And I did not say anything else, and he left after 20 minutes, and I watched him walk out and thought about Patricia's folded piece of paper, which Joanna had put in my bag with my other belongings. I was discharged 12 days after the accident. My bills, the ICU, the surgeries, the specialists, the medications, the physical therapy referrals, were being processed through the commercial insurer and my own policy. Marcus, my attorney, told me the construction company's insurer had already made a preliminary settlement offer that he described as a reasonable starting point, with a tone that suggested it was going to be significantly higher before we were done. I was not financially ruined. I was not even financially strained. I went home to my apartment. I slept for a lot of the first week. Joanna came over most days and brought food and sat with me, and sometimes we watched television, and sometimes we watched television. And sometimes we just sat there, and that was enough. My hearing aid had been damaged in the accident, and the construction company's insurer paid for a new one without dispute. I called Aunt Ruth on my 2nd week home. We talked for a long time. She told me about Gerald, She told me about the trust. She told me what Daniel had said to her on the phone while I was in the hospital, using her fear for me as a doorway to a conversation about her house. Her voice was steady when she told me, the way a person's voice gets steady when they've already finished being shocked and are now just documenting. I told her about the form Daniel had signed. I told her what the physician had told me and what Patricia had written down. I told her about the question in the hallway, the one about what happened if I didn't make it. There was a long silence. Then Aunt Ruth said, "Gerald is going to want to hear this." Gerald wanted to hear it. He also wanted to hear from Marcus, who had been quietly building the larger picture of what happened at the hospital, and had some views about the unauthorized representation of healthcare authority and the nature of the form Daniel had signed. Gerald and Marcus spoke. They had several conversations that I was not part of, between two older men who had spent their careers watching what happened when families didn't put things in writing, and had collectively decided that this particular situation warranted careful and thorough documentation. I also spoke with a patient advocate at the hospital, a woman named Dr. Simmons, who had reviewed my file after the attending physician flagged certain events for administrative review. She confirmed that the form Daniel had signed had no legal standing, that my actual healthcare proxy documentation was valid and had been the governing document, and that the hospital was conducting an internal review of how the initial confusion had occurred. She gave me a copy of my file. I gave a copy to Marcus. I gave a copy to Gerald. I kept a copy in a folder in my apartment, organized and labeled because Aunt Ruth had taught me, by example, that paperwork was love made visible. In May, 8 weeks after the accident, Daniel called me. He called on a Sunday evening and his voice had a particular quality to it that I recognized. Careful, slightly formal, the voice he used when he was managing something. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was recovering well. He said he was glad. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that he had spoken to my mother about some financial matters, and wanted to make sure we were on the same page as a family. I asked him what financial matters he meant. He said something about long-term planning and family resources and the importance of being proactive. I said, "Daniel, I want to make sure I understand what you mean. Are you talking about Aunt Ruth's house?" He paused. Then he said he was just thinking about the future. I said, "I think we should talk about this in person. Can you come to Grand Rapids next Saturday?" He said yes. He seemed relieved, actually. I think he thought the conversation was going to go in a direction that benefited him. It did not go in that direction. Marcus was there. Gerald participated by phone. Joanna sat in my kitchen and did not say a word and did not need to. I had printed everything. The documentation of my healthcare proxy. Patricia's note, the physician's account, the patient's advocate's report, the hospital's internal review findings, which I had received a week earlier and which contained language that Marcus described as useful. The correspondence between Daniel and Aunt Ruth, which she had printed and given to Gerald, who had made copies for everyone. Daniel sat at my kitchen table and turned pages. He didn't say much. Trish wasn't there. He had come alone, which I think he regretted. Toward the end, he said something about how he had only been trying to look out for the family, and the word family hung in the air in my small apartment in a way that I think we both understood differently than we had 20 years ago. Marcus explained, in clear language, what the documentation showed and what the available legal remedies were. He mentioned the word fraud once, not as a threat exactly, but as a description of a category of action that certain behaviors might fall into, depending on how various authorities chose to interpret them. He mentioned that the construction company's civil case was ongoing, and that certain representations Daniel had made at the hospital regarding his authority over my care could become relevant to that proceeding if they became part of the record. Gerald explained, also in clear language, the structure of Aunt Ruth's trust, and the no-contest provisions and the specific implications of any attempt to challenge or interfere with it. Daniel left my apartment 45 minutes after he arrived. He called my mother that evening. I know this because my mother called me the next morning crying. Not the soft, quiet crying, but the other kind. The kind that means something is broken open. She said she didn't know. She said that several times. I believe her. I think she knew Daniel prioritized himself, had always known it on some level, but she had not known the shape that it took when there was something real at stake. She asked me what she should do. I told her I didn't have an answer for that. I told her I loved her, which was true. I told her that what I needed from her was to hear her say that she believed me, not because I needed her permission to be right, but because I had been her daughter for 31 years, and I had been careful and small, and I was done being either of those things. She said she believed me. That was enough. It didn't fix everything. It wasn't supposed to. The personal injury settlement finalized in September. I'm not going to say the number, but I will say that Marcus had been right about the preliminary offer being a starting point. I paid off my student loans. I put money in savings. I bought myself a plane ticket to Portland, Oregon, where Joanna had moved for a job, and I spent a week walking around a city I'd never been to, and eating at restaurants where I didn't know anyone, and feeling, in a way I hadn't felt in a long time, like someone who had room to breathe. Aunt Ruth is fine. Her house is still hers. We have dinner when I visit, which is more often now than it used to be. She teaches me things about cooking that I never learned growing up, and I help her with her laptop when technology becomes confusing, and sometimes we sit on her porch after dark and don't talk about any of it. Daniel and I don't speak. I made that decision in September quietly without announcement. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even angry by then. It was just a door I stopped opening. My mother and I talk on the phone every Sunday now. That's new. I don't know exactly what shifted for her, whether it was what happened or whether it was something she had already been moving toward, slowly, in the way that some people move toward clarity. I don't ask. I just answer when she calls. I still have Patricia's note. It's in the shoebox, next to the photograph of Aunt Ruth and me at her kitchen table. The thing about being someone that people have always treated as an expense is that you start, without meaning to measure yourself in those terms. You start to ask whether you're worth the trouble, whether you're worth the cost, whether the space you take up is justified by whatever you're able to give back. You do this so quietly and for so long that you stop noticing you're doing it. I notice now. I noticed for the first time on the day I woke up with a machine breathing for me and Joanna in the chair beside my bed, and the long, slow understanding that I was alive, not because my brother had decided I was worth keeping, but because a physician had declined to be moved by him, and a nurse had written something down and a woman who loved me had put my paperwork in my file, and my aunt had called her attorney, and all of these people who believed I was worth the trouble had been right. That's the thing nobody tells you about surviving something like this. It's not that it makes you fearless. It's not that it burns away everything small and petty and leaves only what matters. It's quieter than that. It's just that you stop asking the question. You stop wondering if you're worth it, because the answer arrived before you were conscious enough to ask. I was worth it. I am worth it. And I have the paperwork to prove it.